Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today, I am in Durham, North Carolina, at Duke University, to interview one of the deans of the history profession in America, John Hope Franklin. Dr. Franklin has taught at numerous colleges and universities, including North Carolina Central, Howard, Brooklyn College, where he was chairman of the history department, the University of Chicago, where he again was chairman of the history department, and after his putative retirement at Duke University. He is the author of numerous books, including some that entirely changed the way that Americans think about crucial periods in our history. He is the author of many articles, including award-winning ones, has made path-breaking speeches, has headed 3 major organizations of historians, has represented the United States government abroad, and was chair of an important presidential initiative on race. Perhaps it tells you all you need to know that in driving over to the television studio, I passed a very large building called the John Hope Franklin Center. Dr. Franklin is with me today to discuss his recently published autobiography, Mirror to America, which is the subject of 2 one-hour interviews on Books of Our Time. This is the first interview, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the host of Books of Our Time and Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Dr. Franklin, thank you very much for sitting still for 2 interviews of 1 hour each.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Doctor, let me switch off what I had planned to do just a little bit and ask you, what is the John Hope Franklin Center and how did it come into being?
It's a Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies. It was conceived about 5 years ago by a group of people in the field of the humanities and social sciences here at Duke University, and was implemented and carried forward by the president of Duke University at that time, President Nannerl Cohen.
Yes.
She called me in one day and said that you probably have heard this in the streets, but we want to name a program here for you, and I just want to be certain that it's all right with you and that you have been involved in both interdisciplinary and international studies. I said, well, I have been for many years, and I'm flattered and honored that you would want to name this program here for me.
Yeah. So that would mean that Dean Smith is not the only person connected with the academic world in North Carolina that has a large building named after him.
I suppose we would say that we have another thing in common. We have the same person handling our fish ponds.
Well, you know, I was thinking about that as I came over, and as important as basketball is to North Carolina and to the United States, in history, everything that Dean Smith did will be forgotten, but the way that you changed the way we think about the South prior to the Civil War and about the Reconstruction era is going to live a very long time. So there is that.
Thank you.
Tell me what the center does.
Well, the center is for the purpose of attracting people on campus and off campus to come there and focus their interests on certain areas, if they have an interest in those areas, and to work there for a year and to write and to direct programs out of that center. There's a Center for Far Eastern Studies, it's there. There's a Center for African American Studies, it's there. Center for Latin American Studies, and so forth. It doesn't have a curriculum of its own. Yeah. It leans on these various disciplines for its curriculum, but it brings together and focuses its attention to interdisciplinary studies. It is studies of several different fields, and that's its most important activity. And it brings to the center not only Duke professors and students, but professors and students from other parts of the country.
So it's, in a way, it's like several other famous centers. It's different, but in a way, it's like Woodrow Wilson or the Institute for Advanced Studies, or the one out at Stanford.
Right.
Okay. Now, turning to your biography, which, Professor, it is called Mirror to America. Now, a mirror obviously reflects. What is it that you intended Mirror to America to reflect?
I wanted the people of this country to look in the mirror and see themselves and see how they live and what they've done and what the problems are that they have solved and the problems particularly they have not solved. Yeah. I want them to know and to see, as I see it, the various travesties on our society, the way in which we have not lived up to the promises of this country, the way in which we say one thing on one side and another thing on another side, where we take back the things that we think we were going to give to this country, yeah, and to withhold them, yeah, or to restrict the use of these things to certain groups.
Well, it's not a pretty sight that one sees necessarily. You know, I was frankly a little surprised, Professor, that I thought the book was in many respects much milder than I would have thought. Much more charitable, if I may put it this way, much more charitable towards the white race than some people might think we deserve. And I might say that I thought it was particularly mild in comparison to The Color Line, a book which is about 10 years old, if I remember correctly, perhaps 1993. Do you think I'm right about that, or do you think my perception is wrong?
I think I did restrain myself, and I think, frankly, that I wanted to convey the impression that these things, while awful, some of the experiences which I've had have been awful and have been searing and have been in some ways tragic, that I would restrain myself in describing them as I have sought to restrain myself in reacting to them. I don't think you can live through these experiences and internalize them completely without killing yourself. I really honestly believe that. And so in describing the experiences which I've had and the experiences in certain areas which the country has had, I've sought deliberately to restrain myself, to refrain from internalizing these things.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I've always thought that they'd give you a heart attack and a stroke if you really let them get to you, as I say.
Any more than they do.
Yes.
You know, it's very much like there's a common saying these days, let it go, let it go. So in part, to live, one has to let it go. Not fully, not wholly.
No.
One never gets over it entirely, but to some extent you have to let it go.
Right.
Or else it will, as you say, it will literally kill somebody. If you don't mind me bringing them up, in the book you point out, as you have just alluded to, some really traumatic experiences that you went through, starting at, of all things, at age 6. That no human being should have to go through. Now, you know, it's also true that everybody, of every race, religion, description, has something traumatic happen to them when they're young, and we never forget it. And that's just the way life is. But yours were, in many cases, almost all cases, racially related. It's the way America was. I think in part you're saying it's the way America is. And perhaps you would not mind telling people about some of them, starting perhaps with when you and your mother, and I think it was your sister,
Yes.
were put off a train in the middle of the countryside when you were 6 years old. Why this happened, what your mother told you, and what was the effect upon you of what your mother told you?
Well, we lived in a village called Rentersville, Oklahoma, and this was about 1921. And we were going to the town about 6 or 7 miles away called Chakota. Right. We had to flag the train down. The train came through, and there was no reason for it to stop in Rentersville unless someone was going to get on the train. And so we had to flag it down. My mother flagged it down. It slowed to a stop, and then we got on, and it started again. So my mother put us down in the first seat we could find. And it so happened that that was not the coach where we were supposed to sit. So when the conductor came through...
It was a whites-only coach.
Yes, a whites-only coach. When the conductor came through, he announced to us that we were sitting in the wrong coach and that we would have to move. My mother said that she couldn't move. The train was already speeding, and she couldn't move her children, small children, from one coach going through the area where coaches were attached. It was too dangerous, and she told him that. And they had some words, and he said, "I'll stop the train." But this time we'd gone on down maybe another couple of miles, you see, through the countryside. He stopped the train. We got up to move to the so-called black coach, or Negro coach, which was up right behind the engine, a half coach. But instead of our going there, he sort of blocked it and put us off the train. And he directed the engineer to move on. So there we are, standing on the side of the railroad track, the train speeding down, and there we are standing in the countryside. And so we had to move on. We were still closer to Rentersville than we were to Shakota. And so we went back, trudged our way back through the woods to Rentersville. And I began to cry. And my mother asked me, "What are you crying about?" I told her that the man put us off the train. And, I was frustrated and unhappy. And she said, "You shouldn't cry about that." She said, "Don't ever cry about that, because all he was doing what the law said. The law said that we should be separate, and that we should sit in the coach just behind, the half coach, just behind the engine. That's where you get the cinders and all the other things, but that's where we're supposed to sit." She said, "Now, don't you cry about that. You use your energy in order to show people that you're as good as anybody on that train." She said, "Don't cry. Just prove that you're as good as anybody on that train." And I think that's what I've been trying to do for the last...
I was going to say, I had the impression, in fact, as you know, one of the questions that I had was, I think that for 85 years now, you have been living by the creed that your mother inculcated that day.
I think so.
Yeah. And you say several times in your book that you set out to make your mark on behalf of African Americans and the United States and yourself through scholarship and teaching.
And activism.
And activism.
Yeah.
But you make the point that in the scholarship and the teaching, even though one is an activist, one has to be scrupulously fair.
Right.
To both sides.
Right.
Something which, when one feels very strongly about something, is not easy to do.
Nope.
And yet you have done that, and I would say as a consequence, as I've said in the introduction, your book has changed the minds of generations now. Your books, plural, have changed the minds of generations.
Well, I've thought very carefully to work right with restraint. I don't believe that you can maintain anything like a balance, or I don't think you can be persuasive if you are so subjective that you really are preaching what it is that you believe. I think it's much more important to have the kind of restraint that impresses people with your dignity, your charm, and your restraint. That is, you show them by example that although this is an outrage, the treatment of my people by this country, it's an outrage, that I can look at it objectively, with great care, calmly, and call it the way it is.
Professor, two things about that. Of course, you said one will simultaneously have a heart attack and stroke out if one doesn't, to some extent, push it back a little bit. And the other point you made is that the power of persuasion is dependent upon being somewhat restrained.
Right.
Which is true. People don't want to hear somebody rant and rave. It doesn't matter how correct the person is. It's often called preaching to the converted, because that is almost inevitably is what it ends up being. But where did you develop that there? How did you learn that? Where did you learn that?
Well, first of all, I learned it at home. My mother was a very calm person. My father was a lawyer, and he was calm and restrained. Perhaps more restrained than she was, although as I look back, I don't see how either of them endured what they did endure. And I will always believe that my mother's early death, she was 56 when she died, was caused by this effort to contain herself and not to convey her outrage to her children. So I learned it, I think, from her and from my father. And later on, when I became an advanced student, my professor, particularly my professor at Fisk University, who taught me, tutored me, engaged me, led me, and did everything he could to shape my attitudes as well as my life. And he was white.
Right, Ted Currier.
And yet
yes.
he was in my corner all the time. Yeah. And by being in my corner, he could persuade me because I knew he was serious and on my side.
You know, just by the by, I think it's widely accepted that African Americans in America tend to have a higher blood pressure. I think that's the reason that they're having to live with so much that they just keep inside.
Well, I certainly believe that, and my own cardiologist here at Duke University believes it too. We have appeared together on programs, and I have described some of my experiences, and then he has interpreted them in terms of cardiovascular risks, you see, and he has said that there's a direct correlation between the experiences that we have,
yeah,
that is, African Americans have, and our cardiovascular failures.
Yeah. Now, we have a couple of minutes, maybe a minute left in the first segment, but I'm of the anti-Katie Couric, Matt Lauer crowd. I won't cut you off. I have a question. And when you're done answering it, you'll be done answering it, not until then. Tell about, this is just a shocking story, the woman whom you were trying to help across the street when you were 12 years old.
When I was a Boy Scout, I had just taken my oath as a Boy Scout, and one of the things that we were taught to do was to do a good deed every day. So I happened to be downtown in Tulsa at one of the busy intersections, and I saw this woman halting the step, putting one foot off the curb and then pulling it back and not really being sure of where she was going, people rushing by and everything. I said, this is my chance. And I ran over to her and I said, lady, would you like some help across the street? And when I got close to her, I could see she was visually impaired. I think she was completely blind. And she said, oh yes, thank you very much. And she grabbed my arm and we started across the street and we were chatting and she was very pleasant. And then she said, are you colored or white? I said, I'm colored. She said, take your filthy hands off me. And I did. And I retreated and left her there in the streets. I thought that that if she felt that my courtesy did not obliterate my filth, then I should leave her. And I did. You know, and I have some regret, but not too much regret. Because if she was more interested in someone of her own race escorting her than someone who had reached out to her, then I felt she was entitled to have someone of her own race take her.
Well, speaking frankly, Professor, you didn't have a choice, because down there, if you hadn't, you could have been lynched.
Well, I don't know. I think that might be excessive in Tulsa. They had done a lot of things in previous years. This was 1927. And 1921, there had been this awful riot.
Yeah.
And by this time, even white people had on their good manners in Tulsa, and I doubt very much that I would have, anything serious like that would have happened to me. But I would not have held on to her under those circumstances. Not because of my fear of what happened to me, but because of my willingness and my anxiety to satisfy her.
Yeah. Yeah.
If she didn't want me, I didn't want her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's where it was. But I doubt seriously that anything untoward would have happened.
Was there traffic on the street?
Yeah, there was traffic on the street.
Did somebody else help her across? Do you know?
I don't know.
See, to me, it was so bizarre. It was sick that somebody would rather take a chance on getting killed in traffic because they can't see where they're going than to have somebody of a different race help them across the street.
I think it was a kind of sickness. That's what racism is anyway.
Yeah.
It's a sickness. And that didn't greatly surprise me.
Yeah.
Although I must say I was hurt that she had described my hands as filthy when they were not, and that she had rejected my generous offer to help her.
Yeah. Okay, we will go to break now. Stay with us after a short break with some public service announcements. We'll be right back with the second segment of our first show with Dr. John Hope Franklin. Welcome back. Professor, you briefly alluded to the Tulsa riot, and I'd appreciate it if you would tell what that was, the effect it was on it had on your family, and then why was it lost to history for about 80 years?
Well, a Negro chap got on the elevator in Tulsa in 1921. And he was accused of making untoward gestures toward the white elevator operator, and that he went so far as to assault her sexually. This happened on an elevator. I don't know how, but that's what he was accused of. He was arrested, jailed, and there was talk all around the city hall, courthouse, and whatnot, that he was going to be lynched. He had violated the code, so to speak. He was going to be lynched. When the word got out that he was going to be lynched, a group of blacks said they were not going to stand for that he was due a fair trial, and he should get it. And so they said they were going down and protect him. Whites decided that they would go down and lynch him. And so you had these two opposing forces coming and converging on the courthouse, the county jail. And the blacks were urged to retreat, to go back to their side, and that he was going to be all right, be safe. They started back, and then guns began to fire, and everything broke loose. And that's the way the riot started. Blacks were run back into their section of town. And then they began to fire back, to shoot back. And so the whole thing blew open. Stores and shops on the Negro side of town were looted and burned. They began to loot and burn homes throughout. My father had gone there about 6 months before to start his law practice. He found that in Rennesville it was too small, and he decided to make a new start for himself, and so he'd gone up there. We would have followed him when school was out. My mother was teaching, and the two children were in school. The two older ones were away in boarding school. And so he was going to bring us up there on the 1st of June. And we were all packed waiting, and he didn't come. And we wondered why. And there was probably a week before we knew what really had happened. My mother, you see, there's no
radio or TV.
communication, no radio, no TV, no anything like that. We were 60-odd miles away, and there's no way to get there but by train, and trains were not coming through at this point. And so she read in the Muskogee Daily Phoenix that there had been a riot in Tulsa, a race riot, and there had been burning and looting and many, many casualties. It was not known. Then for several more days, my mother did not know whether my father was living or dead.
Yeah, yeah.
And finally she got a short note from him saying that he had been seized and detained in the convention hall during that entire time, and that where he was out now and where he was supposed to bring us when we were going to live there had been wiped off the map, had been burned to the ground, as indeed his office had been. Yeah. And so he said he couldn't come because, one, he had no money at all, had no resources. Two, he had no clothing. And three, he was very busy suing the city, the state that had sent guards over, and the insurance companies. And this was a very, very important time for him to build up a clientele, you see. Yeah. So he said he couldn't come, but he would be there as soon as he could. So in the next several weeks, I guess it was, before he could get away and come down to see us, get on the train. He got on the train and came down those 60-odd miles to see us. He spent the weekend with us, and then he went back. Meanwhile, he said he couldn't move us, didn't have anywhere to move us, didn't have anything to move us with. Yeah. And so for 4 more years, we remained in the village of Rentersville. Yeah. My father would come every few months to see us. It was an awful time for us, and particularly awful, I think, for my mother, who had to assume the responsibility of being both mother and father, husband and wife, you see. And she did that magnificently. Meanwhile, I'm growing up, and I'm making a lot of demands, I guess, as a 8-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old. Yeah. And she's doing everything she could to sort of keep me under control. She's teaching me how to fish. She's teaching me how to play ball and all the rest of it. And she gets a job teaching over in the hills somewhere. And my sister and I then were left to fend for ourselves until she got back riding horseback over the mountains from her school. I have said somewhere, it might have been in my autobiography, that we were perhaps the first latchkey children in the United States. At least we were latchkey, and we had duties to perform every day. Yeah. And it was really quite an experience for us. We had to clean the lamps, lamp chimneys, and fill the lamps with oil, and bring in the wood for the stove, and bring in water from the well, and so forth, and then do our homework before it got dark, where we couldn't do it, because we could not light the lamps.
I was going to say, your mother was super careful, because fire was to be dreaded.
Fire was to be dreaded because there was no fire company or anything like that. If the thing caught fire, house caught fire and got out of control, then we had no house. That was it. Yeah. So we had to be extra careful. Yeah. And she made it quite clear that it was too cold for us to stay in the house alone, that we would go to Miss Collins' house, which was on the way home from where we were in school, and Miss Collins would keep us until she got there. Yeah. But under no circumstances would we light a fire.
Yeah. I know that earlier on, when you were even younger, you used to, I mean, these stories are they're just too much, really. You know, people today, it has been so long since people of any race, religion, or nationality had to live that way, when at one point a lot of people did. Sure. And I must say, Americans don't understand that until the Second World War, what a poor country this was, like all other countries. This was a very poor country by and large. But so these stories are just absolutely fascinating to me, and including the one, by the way, where when you were even younger, 3 and 4 years old, you used to sit in your mother's classroom while she taught. And
went to school with her. And I certainly at 3 years of age, I was sitting in the back of her room. Yeah. And she was teaching first grade, and she was putting things on the board. letters and words and that sort of thing. And she had put me on a back row all by myself, and she gave me pencil and paper. That was the purpose of keeping me quiet and making certain that I was preoccupied. But I thought that was for me to do what the other children were doing. They were copying off the board. So I decided to copy off the board myself. She came by one day just to see what I was doing. I was just scratching everything, she thought. And I was making words, sentences, letters, the way she was writing them on the board. Sure, that was for me as well as for the children. And so by 4 or 5 I was reading. Because I was sitting in a room. And it was just as easy to do what she was doing as to do something on my own, probably easier.
Sure.
So that's what I did.
You know, around 2000 or so, roughly, the Tulsa riots came back into public prominence.
Public conscience.
Pardon me?
Conscience, the public
conscience. And I think I think there were some reparations given, 80 years too late, and it should never have happened to begin with. But I remember that was the first time I had ever heard of them. So what happened? Why was it buried? It became lost to history.
Well, there are a lot of things lost to history. I can give you one example. Very few people know that the biggest slave market probably in the United States was in Washington, D.C., right in the shadow of the nation's capital. That's not known.
No, it's not.
We remember what we want to remember, and we write our history, for the most part, the way we think it will be all tidied up and neat and so forth. So we don't talk about these things. The mayor of Tulsa told me a few years ago that she was a grown woman. She was born in Tulsa, but she was a grown woman before she even knew that there had been a race riot in Tulsa, you see. So that's the way we do. That's the way we do our history. We tidy it up, and then we forget the things that we don't want to remember. And that's the way it was in Tulsa. I knew about it because my father and mother made it clear that I should know about it. But there were large numbers of people in Tulsa, right there up and down the same streets that had been looted and burned, who didn't remember that Tulsa was the scene of one of the bloodiest, most disgraceful interracial conflicts that this country had ever known.
Yeah, sure. Ranking with Detroit, Chicago, you name it. You name it. You know, you say about remembering what we wish to remember. Now, I'm going to find it. I have a book here. It's one of your books. The Militant South, 1800 to 1861. We'll show the cover of this on the television set. I guess they can't see it, but it'll be shown on the television set. Now, the reason I bring this up in connection with what you just said is that when you wrote this book, this book essentially says the South was in a very violent place from 1800 to 1860, and you cite many of the things that have become common knowledge today: the military academies, the code duello, the fact that the plantation owners were a law unto themselves. You know, there were many things. When your book came out, I remember you said in your autobiography, when that book came out, somebody said, I think it might have been E. Merton Coulter, who ultimately got his from you, I must say, this is a Negro's view of the Old South. I believe that's a direct quote.
Yes, it was not Coulter. It was a very distinguished historian of the South.
As opposed to, no, I'm just kidding.
And he was asked to read it by the Harvard University Press. It was considering publishing it. And he said, I don't know why you would want a Negro's view of the South. But if that's what you want, I suppose that Franklin would be as good as you could get. And the director of the press was outraged by it. That's why he told me, he said, you know, we're not interested in publishing this as a Negro view of the South. We're interested in publishing it because we think that it's worthy of publication. It tells us something we don't know about the South. He said, and he very much resented that approach and that aspect of it, this judgment that this historian made. And he, like I, believe that there's no such thing as a Negro view of the South. Yeah. It's ridiculous and absurd on its very face.
Yeah.
And so he told me that because he wanted me to know that they were publishing it. Harvard University Press was publishing it. They were publishing it because it was not a Negro view of the South, but it was a true view from of the South, the way he thought it ought to be. And so they published the Militant South. And it was later republished by the Illinois University Press. That's what you have.
Yes, that's what I have. And you know, that book was first published, if I remember correctly, in about 1956.
That's right.
And the University of Illinois Press republished it 2002. That's 46 years later, yes. Which was the second republication. But that says something, that they would see fit to republish it 46 years later. Let me talk a little, or ask you a little bit about the South. Well, before I do that, let me ask you about another aspect of the South where your views have changed, been instrumental in changing things dramatically. Your book on Reconstruction.
Yes.
Explain how you first started out criticizing the prior view when Coulter wrote a book, and what changes your views made in the prior existing view of the South.
Well, I have the view that in the literature of the South, that is in the history of the South, from the end of Reconstruction, almost to certainly down to the 1940s, that the South really won the war. Ideologically, they won the war.
Amen. Thank you for saying that. I've been saying that for years. Thank you. I'm glad to hear somebody else who really knows what he's talking about saying.
Yeah, well, I think they won the war in the literature and in the sentiment and the politics and whatnot, because they had overthrown the institutions, the legislatures and so forth that had been established at the end of Reconstruction. They'd overthrown them. They had set up a very remarkably backward system of in social relations of races and that sort of thing. They'd instituted a program of segregation like you would never dream. It would tax the imagination to do what they did. They had described race in the most remarkable terms. By 1910, they said 1 drop of Negro blood in a white person makes him a Negro. He's no longer white. He could be as white as a driven snow. But if he has 1 drop, he's no longer white, he's black. And the same thing was true in all the most remarkable definitions of social relations that you can imagine were instituted in this period. So, and that's what the South wanted, and that's what they got. And the North looked silently by and let it go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then, and that was what was taught during that period. That was what was taught. That blacks were wild and uneducable, that they were uncivilized and couldn't be made civil, and so forth. So there's a remarkable description.
And that the legislatures were filled with these drunken savages. That was a big thing.
But so that should never happen again.
Yeah.
And this was and the North accepted that view.
And it's called the Redeemer view of all things.
Yes, the South had been redeemed.
Yeah. It
had been won over. Well, here comes a very distinguished historian of the South in 1947, named E. Merton Coulter, the University of Georgia. He and a man named Stevenson were to edit a history of the South. He published the first history, the South during Reconstruction, in 1947. And I was asked to review that by the editor of the Journal of Negro Education, and he wanted me to review the whole series as they came out. When I saw this book and read it, I realized that there was much more to it than just a book review, that I wanted to have. I wanted to examine it extensively. And so I asked him if I could write an article, and he said, by all means, do. And I did. And I took Coulter on, and I challenged him in everything he claimed about blacks being ignorant and blacks being drunk in the legislature, blacks chasing white women and raping them and all that. He had everything in there that you could imagine. And I challenged him on these things and argued that he didn't know what he was talking about. This was a part of the myth that had been built up since Reconstruction. And that's how the South had won Reconstruction. And I said, you're no longer entitled to gloat over this because it's not true. It's just not true. And I went on to prove it wasn't true. And I distributed that the off-print of that article, to 200 or more influential historians throughout the United States to show them that there was another view of Reconstruction and that I was sponsoring or promoting that other view. And that started a real furor in the historical profession. But I stood my ground, and Coulter had to retreat. And while he did not respond to me because I was beneath him, once a white historian took up some of my views, then he attacked the white historian. He wasn't going to attack a black historian because I didn't matter. I wasn't important enough. I wasn't enough for him to deign to even recognize, you see. And so, but I think I had the last laugh for that view of Reconstruction that had been entertained by historians and others before Coulter, and while during Coulter's time began to retreat. That view is no longer the view generally held. And I'm deeply thankful that I had a part in revising that history of Reconstruction. And it is fairly widely accepted now.
Yeah. They want me to go to break, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to wait because I want you to talk about this. Actually, you had more than just something to do with it. Your work was seminal in it, as I understand the situation. One of the things that seems to me to have been the saddest in the long run was that, I mean, there are things which are horrid and tragic, like lynchings, like what they did to, like Jim Crowism and so forth in its entirety. But one of the things that seems to me saddest in the long run was that they prevented African Americans from getting one of the things they very much wanted to get after the war, that was education. And that had just a devastating effect, which we are living with today, in my judgment.
Yes, it's very interesting you put it like that. There were schools founded for the education of blacks in the years immediately following the war. The University of which I attended was founded in 1866, for example. And there was a whole lot of African-American colleges and universities, we call them now historically black universities, established. And then there were the public schools and the preparatory schools, some private as well as public. And the zeal for learning was very intense. But what you get is a decline in that. Particularly after World War I, you get a significant decline in the movement to establish and maintain schools for blacks. And that's all right, and particularly as whites take over in the South, where the majority of blacks are still living, whites take over the school system generally and will withhold from the segregated black schools the facilities and supplies and training that they need to keep up. So there's a significant decline, I'd say, following World War I, a decline that is still with us. And that's why there was this fight to eliminate segregated schools, because if you're pushing all the resources, talent and so forth into the white schools, the only way you could get an education that was comparable to what they were getting was to be in the schools with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that represents the great drive, the thrust to eliminate segregation in the schools, and which preoccupied the attention of many of us in the post-World War II period.
Yeah. Professor, I am going to obey my masters here and go to break. But when we come back, I want you to talk about two things, if you would. I want to ask you a little more about the South, and I want to ask you a little more about whether anything got lost by integration. An unusual view, but one which I have read, and I've sometimes read it put forth by African Americans, and for reasons which is in your book. I don't know that you put it in this context, but some of the background facts are in your book. Stay with us. We'll be right back with the concluding segment of the first interview with one of the deans of American history, John Hope Franklin. Welcome back. John, you commented that you had to have integration because all the money and so forth was put into the white schools and almost nothing into the black schools. I want to ask the question, which is perhaps an unusual question, but I have read this many times, that perhaps something was lost. There had to be integration because there were great gains, but perhaps something also was lost. You describe what was demanded of you in high school, though you went to a school which in terms of facilities was not nearly the equal of the white school across town. And I have read, and you're well aware of more than I, of what happened at Dunbar High School in Washington. And similarly, both Tulsa and Washington, and you happen to mention in your book, Durham, when you first came here in the 30s and early 40s, had significant black business districts. All of this seems to have gone by the boards because of integration. What do you think about that?
Well, let me say first of all that everything was not lost under the segregated system. Much was lost. Much was lost. They had to have enough to keep the Negroes quiet, so to speak. That is, in my own high school had some facilities which were fairly good, enough to keep us quiet, and so that we wouldn't be ungovernable and be difficult, obstreperous, and so forth. So it was a sort of it was rationed out to us in a way that was supposed in a way that we were to be quiet as a result of the generosity in certain instances. But I think you're quite right in pointing out that
you would have at least something to lose.
Yeah, we'd have something, but there was a good deal lost. Now, what was lost in integration was several things. One was that as long as you had integration, as long as you had segregation, the opportunities for educated blacks were very limited, very limited. So that there were, some of my teachers, if they had been able to go into other areas, business, for example, commerce, and so forth, the schools would have been less adequate. But they didn't have that opportunity. So I had some of the best teachers you can imagine.
Yeah.
Some of the best. Because that's about all they could do. They could preach or teach, you see. In terms of white collar jobs, they could go to other things, but that would be in another level of income as well as status. And the same thing was true of other areas. For example, there were black newspapers, various other black institutions that served the black community that began to decline with integration, you see. And the very opportunities that opened up in other areas closed diminished opportunities in certain select areas that had flourished up to that time. So that your Negro newspapers, for example, today are not what they were when I used to sell newspapers when I was a boy.
Yeah.
The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier and the Norfolk Journal and Guide, very big, and newspaper with wide circulations and so forth. And they were very cut back by desegregation or by what you call integration. So that it has its plus and its minus sides, to be sure. Probably another aspect of it is that even in schools that are desegregated, particularly if they have white teachers who do not know much about the capacities of black children, abilities of the black children, who've come up in a society which denigrates them and has the least expectation of them. When they begin to teach them, their expectations are what they always were, rather low.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time. I'm not saying that the time would not come or will not come when white teachers have high expectations of black children. But I don't think it's come yet, thanks to our long period of segregation and degradation.
Yeah.
So the expectation of them is low, and that has the most deleterious effect on the training of black children.
Yeah. One of the points you make, and one of the points I've read about Dunbar High School, is, my God, they demanded a lot out of those kids, and the kids performed.
Yes. Look how many PhDs there were at Dunbar High School, you see, teaching literature and chemistry and biology and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's because they couldn't get jobs in white colleges and universities.
Yeah.
The only place they could get to do anything was in Dunbar High School or places like Dunbar.
Yeah, yeah. You know, this being America, people understanding sports, it's a lot, it bears analogy to the old Negro leagues. Wonderful, wonderful ball playing. Integration came, no more Negro leagues. Yes. Of course, everybody understood that now the greatest major leaguers were African-American Negro ball players, but no more Negro leagues, just like no more Dunbar High School.
That's right.
Yeah. John, it is my view, and I'm interested in yours, not mine, but just to set the stage, it is my view that, frankly speaking, the South has controlled this country for all but 16 years of its existence. In other words, from 1860 to 1876, that's the exception. And the South has always been one party, therefore has outsized power. It's always been very conservative to reactionary, et cetera, et cetera. And I really personally think that, as you put it in terms of they won the war, I think they won the peace. I think they've won almost everything. What's your view of all that?
Well, you put it somewhat more bluntly than I would, I suppose.
I'm not as restrained.
But I can't argue against that. I just was reading a book not long ago by Bill Luchtenberg on The White House Looks South, which deals with the way in which the South had enormous influence in the period after World War II.
Oh, yes.
See? Enormous influence, you know. And even when the president was not Southern, as in the case of Kennedy, the policies were influenced by the South to a remarkable degree.
They controlled the Congress.
And then, of course, the Congress was controlled in that same way, and the various agencies of the federal government were controlled. So the South has enjoyed enormous strength and power from George Washington to the present.
Yeah.
And when the when the Democratic Party got weak in the South, then the Republican Party became the party of the South and continued the policies that the Democratic Party formerly had.
Which is about where we are today,
yes,
as we sit here and speak about this.
Right, right.
I have to wrap up the first segment, but you sit right there. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to tape a second show, which will be shown subsequently, with Dr. John Hope Franklin, one of the great historians of the United States. Thank you for being with us, and be with us again.